Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria of course, and this is a video with a difference because I'm on the floor at your feet. I'm here to weigh some swords. Why am I doing that? Well, first of all, for several reasons. I thought it'd be interesting, number one. It's something I've been meaning to do for a little bit of time. I have done weighing things videos in the past, but in recent months I've noticed that there are a few websites online that are, I won't say spreading false information, but I think that they're misleading. And so some people are getting the impression that some swords are lighter, in some cases heavier than they actually are. So what I was going to do, because obviously I own a fair number of swords, I've got 12 here. All of these 12 swords, every single one of them, is Napoleonic era. So what I thought I would do is do like with like. So this is the Napoleonic sword weighing. It's the weigh up, basically, the weigh session. Now, I don't have everything from the Napoleonic era, obviously. These are all British swords, okay? So these are British Napoleonic swords, and there's a few quite well-known models, patterns that I don't have here at the moment, okay? So one example is the 1796 Spadroon, which I do actually have one of, but I just haven't laid it out here, so maybe I'll do that another time. But I've got two small swords and a hanger, and then I've got a bunch of sabres, and basically most of the rest of the sabres are cavalry sabres, but I do actually have three infantry officers sabres as well. For weighing, I'm using a crappy old set of scales, but you know what? They're quite reliable. I actually bought some digital scales, and for some reason they do not handle swords very well. I think I need to buy some of those scales like you use for weighing fish, but if you use normal kitchen scales, for some reason the digital ones don't handle swords very well. They give different readings depending on where you put them and that kind of stuff. So I'm using the reliable old plastic weighing scales. I'll just check that it is zeroed. I did zero it before I started filming. Do a little bit. There we go, it's zeroed now. So what we're going to start off with, I'll move along the line. So the first sword we're going to look at is a Colichemarde small sword. I've got videos on these if you're wondering what the hell's a Colichemarde small sword. Well, I have done these before. So look up small sword, search in my videos for small sword, and you'll find stuff about this. So essentially, they're slightly beefier than a normal small sword. It's got a broader section at the base of the blade. So let's have a little look at the weight of this. Obviously you have to weigh them around the point of balance. That is pretty light, so that is 480 grams, okay? So it's just under 500 grams. There we go, that's the weight that it is. That's about the weight, incidentally, of a modern fencing, sport fencing sabre. So 480 grams, make sure it goes back to zero, it does. So the Colichemarde small sword, 480 grams. This small sword is rather unusual. It doesn't have a Colichemarde blade, but it has an unusually substantial hilt. And I know it's Napoleonic because it's got a GR, George Rex, gilt and crown decoration on the blade, which means it's an officer's small sword. It's a military small sword rather than just a civilian small sword. Again, find the point of balance for that, which is a few centimeters up from the cross. This is lighter. This one is pretty much bang on 400 grams, perhaps a shade under, so let's call it about 395 grams. Okay, and it goes back to zero again afterwards. So that's a lighter small sword, as we'd expect. Colichemarde small swords with the broader base tend to be heavier. Good. Next up is the hanger. Well, as you'd expect, so hangers are short sabres essentially. They're probably a hangover or an evolution of the earlier Langmesser and falchion, and indeed hanger, they used to be known as in 15th century England. So it's probably not a new weapon, probably a weapon that's been around for a very long time, but it's just taken on a detailed shape. The actual detailed shape of it is that of the late 18th century. And again, this has military engraving on the blade, so I know this is a military one. It's got GR on it, and it's probably a naval officer's hanger, although it could be infantry. Right, so the point of balance is a bit further up on that one. Obviously you would expect this, you would expect hangers and cutlasses. Cutlasses maybe not because they've got large guards, but you expect hangers to be somewhat lighter. So I just move that so that's more into shot for you. There we go. You'd expect them to be lighter than a cavalry sabre because there's less metal in them. They're shorter, aren't they? And that is 700 grams, pretty much spot on. Yep, spot on, 700 grams. So there we go. So it's definitely heavier than the small swords. The small swords being 480 and about 395, and this one is up there now to bang on 700. Yeah, 700 grams. So I think that should be interesting to some of you, because I notice particularly people who are doing Italian styles of sabre argue that the swords, the gymnasium sabres that we use for British military sabre, are too heavy for them. I can't argue with that. They did have Italian gymnasium sabres that were definitely lighter than the British gymnasium sabres. But in terms of the weight of the actual military swords, well, there you've got a hanger that weighs 700 grams. That's just a hanger, okay? And in Italian sabre, lots of people are only using 650 gram sabres. So that is very light, to put that into context. Right, this is not something I've actually, I don't think, I've not done a specific, I have shown some video before, but I've not done an actual video just about it. It's a 1788 pattern officer's version of the cavalry sabre. So this is what came before the 1796. There's a 1796 there. Okay, the 1788. I've got to say, the 1796 gets all of the fame and all of the glory and all of the attention, but I really like the 1788. It's longer and it's proportionately lighter than the 1796. I like the extra reach that you get on it, and I just really like the design of it. It's not as curved as the 1796. Yeah, it's not as broad up here, so it probably doesn't cut with as much authority. But as an actual weapon to use as a weapon, I really, really like it. Anyway, let's see how much it weighs. Let's find the balance point. Balance point, often with cavalry sabres, the balance point is further up, as you can see. It's a good few inches, probably about 8 inches up from the point. And this is the 1788 pattern officer's version, and it weighs 840, maybe a shade under, 830 grams. Okay, so check it goes back to 0, it does. So we're going up in weight. I'm not saying that that's going to continue all the way up the line, I shouldn't think it will do. So that hanger was 700 grams, and I've just forgotten what it was now, 830. Yeah, that's right. So the 1788 pattern, I've got no reason to think that that's either a particularly heavy or a particularly light example. 830 grams. To put that into context, a lot of the gymnasium sabres that we use for fencing practice that you'll see in videos on my channel and other channels are around 850 grams. So this is pretty close to that. It's actually slightly lighter, but remember, this has a simple knuckle bow guard. A lot of the weight really, like hundreds of grams of the weight in gymnasium sabres and later period sabres is in the guard. As soon as you have a simpler knuckle bow guard like this, it makes the entire sword lighter. Okay, right, now let's go on to the 1796. Now, before I do, I am aware that there is a website somewhere online that states that the weight of a 1796 sabre is 570 grams. That is complete rubbish, okay? I have never, ever, and I have probably owned in the region of 20 or 30 1796 light cavalry sabres. I have never experienced anyone even close to 570 grams. They usually weigh around 800 grams. Okay, let's see how much this one weighs. Again, finding the balance point, it's quite far up with the 1796. Although interestingly, it's not further up than the 1788, but the 1788 is a longer blade. Well, there we go, folks. 570 grams, that website claims. This one is 980. Okay, so there's a 1790. I'm not saying that this is necessarily a light one or a heavy one or anything else. I would say it's perhaps slightly heavier than average, but that is 980 grams. Okay, weight again, it's gone back to 0. Yeah, I mean, it's just under 1 kilogram. Yeah, 980 grams. Okay, so there we go, the 1796, at least this one, and this is an officer's one incidentally, but it's not an ornate officer's one, it's a basic officer's one. This weighs 980 grams, which is, 150 grams heavier than this 1788 pattern, despite the fact that, as you can see, the 1788 pattern is slightly longer, although admittedly the 1796 is broader, okay? Right, for comparison, I have another 1796 here, but this 1796 is a trooper's sword, not an officer's sword, and it's not actually a Napoleonic era one. I've included it here as a almost like a test, this is actually, these were specifically made in the mid-19th century by a company called Mole, Robert Mole and Sons of Birmingham, and they were made to equip Indian cavalry, but they were made to the same patterns and the same statistics as the earlier Napoleonic ones. So it's marked on the back, Robert Mole, and it's sharp, incidentally, and I know that this is a Victorian one rather than a Georgian one. However, it should be the same as an earlier Georgian one, more or less. I would say the only slight difference is they tend to have slightly straighter grips, but anyway. There we go, again try and find the balance point. There, whoop, there we go. It wants to twist this one on the... There we go, right, let's see what that is. So this is lighter than that officer's one. This one is 900 grams. Okay, so there we go. We've got two 1790, and it's spot on 900 grams. We've got two 1796s there. Bear in mind, one was 980 grams and one was 900 grams. Okay, and the 1788 was much lighter at 830 grams. So there we go. This exactly tallies with the weight of the gymnasium sabres that we're using. So the Reginier ones are, I think, 900 grams, thereabouts, sometimes over. But generally speaking, all of the gymnasium sabres that we're using are between 850 and 950 grams, which corresponds with these swords. Now you might say, but they're cavalry swords. Well, as we'll see in a minute, cavalry swords aren't necessarily heavier than infantry officers' swords. There seems to have been an optimal operating weight, at least in the British military, and I would say French definitely as well, that was around this range, regardless of whether it was infantry or cavalry. Yes, there's a slight tendency for cavalry swords to be slightly heavier on average than the infantry ones, but we're really talking about an average difference of maybe only between 30 and 80 grams. Okay, we're not talking about 100 grams or more. Right. So this, I don't think I've ever shown this before, so this is an officer's version of the heavy cavalry, so the 1796 pattern heavy cavalry officer's sword, and you'll see it's got a large guard there, the so-called ladder hilt, or early version of squirrel hilt, and it's because it's symmetrical and it's large, you would expect there to be more weight in this, and it's a longer blade. It's a 35-inch blade. In this case straight, and also in this case with a clipped back point, okay, a bit like a Bowie knife, to make it better for thrusting. It's marked GR, so we know it's Georgian, we know it's Napoleonic era, and it has been service sharpened. Right. And service sharpening would indeed reduce a bit of weight, but not very much. And it is slightly over 900 grams, it's about 910 grams. Okay, so there we go. Despite the fact it's longer and despite the fact it's got a larger hilt, it actually weighs in the same range as these 1796 light cavalry sabres. Okay, so the heavy cavalry one in this case, 910 grams, and certainly the troopers ones tend to be heavier than the officers ones in the case of the heavy cavalry swords, based on my experience. Right, next up we're getting into we've got three non-regulation swords coming up. Okay, first of all is a non-regulation, and this is from the very end of the Napoleonic era, so this could be from sort of Battle of Waterloo 1815 period right the way through to about 1820. You'll notice it's got this is the one that's normally on my wall behind me when I'm talking. It's got a beak nose pommel fully enclosed, which dates it to between 1815 and 1820-ish. And it's a pipe back blade. It's one of the early pipe back blades, but you'll see that the overall shape of it is clearly inspired by the 1796 light cavalry sabre. Now this is a fairly big sword, it's a 35-inch blade, and I can tell you it's not light, and the point of balance is quite far up the blade. It also has etched false woots on the blade. Right, I can see already that's quite heavy, it's over a kilogram. Okay, so that is what is it? So it's not, I think it's about 1020, yeah, so 1020. It's 1020 grams. Okay, so it's very slightly over 1 kilogram. So that is a, you know, over 1 kilogram sword. And yes, it is a fairly big sword, and this is probably getting to the upper end of the spectrum for what Napoleonic cavalry swords reach. Both in terms of size and in terms of weight. But remember, it's only got a simple knuckle bow. If that had a 3-bar hilt, or if it had a, you know, like a later Victorian style, more enclosed half basket, it would be even heavier than this. Okay, so that's over a kilogram. Interesting, isn't it, that these two swords, they don't look so different in size, and yet this one was just over 900 grams and this one's just over 1000 grams. Right, now, this sword you have all seen before, I hope. This is my Wootz-bladed, so this is very non-regulation and very unusual. I've really only included it in here because it does historically fit within the same context as these other swords. Yes, it's an Indo-Persian blade, possibly Persian rather than Indian, but it is a 1796 style hilt, so this was in use in the same period as these other swords. And it is a heavy sword, and it does have a point of balance far from the hand, very far from the hand. There we go. I did weigh this before, but I can't remember what it was. Wow. Okay, I'm going to check that it's actually drifted slightly from 0, so I'm just going to recalibrate slightly. I didn't remember it being this heavy when I weighed it before. So this is 1,200 grams, there we go, 1,200 grams. For rough comparison, my rapier, which has a 40-inch blade on it, is 1,300 grams, and that's accurately modelled on one from the Wallace collection, which weighs the same. So don't think rapiers are light. Rapiers aren't small swords. Small swords and rapiers are very different things, and rapiers are large and can be heavy swords. They're not always, but they can be, because they can be really quite large. So this is 1,200 grams. This is almost certainly going to be the heaviest sword here. But again, those people who say that, oh, a 1796 should be 570 grams, where? Show me a 570 gram 1796. This one, which is a Wootz-blade on a 1796 hilt, is 1,200 grams. Is it a bit of a beast to wave around? Yes, it is. But can I use it? Yeah, I can. Okay, right. Now, we're going to move on to 3 swords that are infantry officers' swords now, okay? As we have to admit, the hanger is an infantry officer's sword as well. So first up is this. Make sure it's all in shot. There we go. Now this is a lovely sword. I will make a video about, but I haven't done it yet. And this is specifically for an officer of rifle volunteers. Okay, so we know it's a rifles sword, and it's relatively, a rifles officer sword, it's relatively shorter. It's under a 30-inch blade. I think it's about 28 inches. So it's kind of between hanger length and saber length, okay? And it feels relatively light, quite responsive. The point of balance feels closer to the hand, and it's not a big sword, but nevertheless you see the shape of it is very much like a 1796 light cavalry saber. And if I just grab the 1796, is very clearly inspired by it. It's just scaled down, it's just a bit smaller, okay? Small. So let's stick this on the weigher, on the scales. Well, it's not really light, it's 880 grams. Okay, so 880 grams, despite the fact that this is a relatively small, and it feels light to me anyway, probably because the weight's distributed over a shorter lever, shorter length. But this feels like a very light and responsive, but also with a fair amount of power in the chop sword, and yet that's 880 grams. Okay, again, where's this 570 gram light cavalry saber? I certainly don't own one. So this is 880 grams, even though it's smaller than a cavalry sabre, and it's for an officer fighting on foot as an officer of rifles. Okay, let's move along to, we have two 1803 patterns. So Nick Thomas of AHF will like this bit, hopefully. He probably liked the rifles one as well, I hope so. These are both blue and gilt, both very high quality 1803 pattern infantry officers' swords. Very, very lovely swords. This one with an ivory hilt, and this one with a horn hilt, or horn grip rather. Very, very nice things. Again, you can see that these are modelled on the 1796 light cavalry sabre, or inspired by, certainly in terms of the blade, and the hilts were brought in 1803 based on what some regiments were unofficially allowing their officers to wear. And this is an alternative. These were brought in as an alternative to the spadroon, because as we all know, spadroons are a bit rubbish and these sabres are quite good. So officers were quite happy to switch from spadroons to these. Right, let's do the ivory hilted one first, which I think should be the lighter one. Okay, so you can see it's got about a 30-inch blade, blue and gilt, brass hilt, ivory grip. Point of balance about 6 inches from the guard. Right, so this is over 900, it is 950, pretty much slap in the middle between 900 and 1000. Just check it goes back to 0, it does. Yeah, say 940, 950. So that's about, that's quite surprising to me actually, because it feels lighter than that. That is between 940 and 950 grams. That's the ivory gripped one. Okay, let's put that to one side. Now let's have a look at this one, which I believe to be the heavier one, but I might be wrong. This has got a broader blade on it and it's slightly longer as well. This is a 32-inch blade, which is quite unusually long actually for an 1803 pattern. Again, balance point about 6 inches from the guard. And it is heavier, but not a lot. It's about 980 grams. Okay, so 980 grams, that's surprising. It's only just under a kilogram. So actually what we found is, in this bizarre case, it seems like the infantry officers' swords are actually heavier than some of the cavalry officers' swords. It's almost the reverse of what you'd expect. I will put these stats below this video, so you don't have to, obviously do watch the video back and make sure the adverts play and watch it lots of times and share it with all your friends. If you found this interesting, do subscribe. If you're not subscribed, please share the video everywhere. Hopefully this will function as a document to, I suppose, counter some of the bizarre weight distributions I've seen published on the internet. As you can see, these are 12 genuine antique swords from my collection. They're not specially picked. I don't own a lot of Napoleonic swords. I mostly own Victorian period swords. So they're not specially picked because they're light or specially picked because they're heavy. I have literally just taken the only 12 Napoleonic period swords I had easily to hand, and I have weighed them in front of you. Obviously you can't see the scale, so you're going to have to trust me on this, but I have no reason to lie. All of these swords, with the exception of the hanger starts at 700, doesn't it? But with the exception of that, with the exception of the small swords and the hanger, all of these full size, should we say, sabres, regardless of whether they're for cavalry or for infantry, are basically all over 800 grams, and they're up to 1,200 grams. Now, I accept that the 1,200 gram, the Wootz one here, that is definitely an outlier, okay? But if we just look at all of the other swords, which I would say are all fairly average, they might not necessarily be average quality, but they're not especially heavy, they're not especially light, they're just examples, typical examples of what they are. They all weigh between 800 grams and 1,000 grams, okay? So I think that's interesting. It also confirms what I've been saying for years, but some people have contradicted me and gone, oh Matt, I know a sabre that weighs 600 grams, I know a sabre that weighs 500 grams. I'm not saying that they don't exist somewhere. But I haven't seen one, and I haven't owned one, and I've owned hundreds and hundreds of swords now. I buy and sell all the time. A lot of swords go through my hands, and the fact is that typical weights for British 19th century, and I would go not just British, for most European and North American 19th century swords, or should we say sabres and broadswords, is between 800 grams and 1,000 grams. Cheers folks for watching, and please share the video and give us a like. Thanks a lot. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We have extra videos on Patreon, and you can follow us on Facebook.